The wolf's intervention. The rough-hewn block felt cold beneath Ilara's chin, smelling faintly of old blood and damp earth. Her breath hitched, a thin, reedy sound lost in the clamour of the courtyard. The crowd, a faceless, roaring beast, pressed against the hastily erected barricades, eager for the spectacle. Sunlight, sharp and unforgiving, glinted off the executioner's axe, a heavy, gleaming arc held high above her neck. She could feel the faint tremor in the ground as he shifted his weight, preparing for the downward swing. Her mind, strangely clear in these final seconds, didn't replay memories of a life unfulfilled, but rather focused on the absurdity of it all. A stolen silver goblet, a trinket she'd never even seen, had become her death sentence. Lord Carl's voice, smoothly condemning, echoed in her memory, sealing her fate with a single, practiced accusation. She closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable, a silent plea for a quick end. A hush fell over the crowd, a sudden, unnatural silence that prickled her skin. It was not the reverent quiet before a solemn act, but a sharp, startled intake of breath. The executioner's shadow, which had loomed large and menacing, wavered. Ilara felt a faint vibration, then a sudden, crushing weight against her back. Not the axe, but something warm, impossibly solid and covered in coarse fur. A low growl, deep and resonant, ripped through the air, vibrating through the very stones of the courtyard. It was a sound that commanded immediate, absolute attention, silencing every whisper, every gasp. Her eyes snapped open. The axe, still poised, was frozen mid-air. Its descent had been halted, not by the executioner's will, but by a barrier of white fur and muscle. Whisper, King Lyra's wolf, stood directly between Ilara's neck and the gleaming blade. The magnificent creature, a spectral white against the dark wood of the block, had launched itself forward, its powerful shoulder pressing against the axe's shaft, deflecting its path. Its amber eyes, usually calm and watchful, now blazed with a fierce, untamed fire fixed on the bewildered executioner. The growl continued, a warning thrumming in the very air. King Lyra, seated on a raised dais overlooking the grim proceedings, felt a cold shock pierce through his usual stoicism. His wolf, Whisper, was an extension of himself, his instincts, his very soul. For Whisper to interfere in such a public, decisive manner was unprecedented, unthinkable. He had given no command, felt no surge of protective instinct, yet his wolf had acted with a speed and ferocity that left the court stunned. A ripple of nervous murmuring spread through the noblemen gathered around the dais. Lord Coil, ever at the king's right hand, leaned forward, a frown creasing his usually placid brow. "My king," he began, his voice a low, concerned murmur. "Whisper. He has never acted so erratically. Perhaps the beast is ill." Lyra ignored him, his gaze fixed on the tableau below. Whisper stood firm, an immovable bulwark, its fangs bared in a silent snarl. The executioner, a man of hardened nerve, was visibly trembling, the axe slipping slightly in his grasp. The girl, Ilara, remained pressed against the block, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a fragile, burgeoning hope. There was something in her gaze, a quiet strength, that Lyra hadn't noticed before. A strange current, a prickling sensation, ran through Lyra. It was a feeling he associated with the shifting of the ancient forest, the silent warnings of a coming storm. He felt a faint, almost imperceptible pull, a resonance with the wolf's fierce protectiveness. It was as if Whisper was not just protecting the girl, but something about the girl. "Hold!" Lyra's voice, though not raised, cut through the tense silence like a blade. It was a command that brooked no argument, a sound of absolute authority. The executioner froze, the axe still caught against Whisper's shoulder. "Stand down." The executioner, relieved, lowered the axe slowly, carefully disengaging it from the wolf. Whisper did not move, its gaze still fixed, unwavering on the man. Lyra descended from the dais, his boots clicking softly on the flagstones. The crowd, sensing a shift in the wind, fell silent once more, their curiosity now overshadowing their bloodlust. Lord Cale followed a step behind, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes narrowed with a flicker of something Lyra couldn't quite decipher. As Lyra approached the block, Whisper turned its head, its eyes meeting his. In their depths, Lyra saw not madness, but a fierce, undeniable conviction. He knelt beside his wolf, placing a hand on its powerful neck. The fur was thick, vibrant with life. "What is it, old friend?" he murmured, his voice low enough only Whisper could hear. The wolf responded with a soft nudge of its head against his hand, then nudged its nose towards Alara. Lyra looked at the girl, really looked at her. For the first time, her face was pale, streaked with dirt and unshed tears, but her eyes held a surprising depth, a quiet intelligence. She was just a servant, unremarkable in appearance, yet his wolf, an animal known for its infallible instincts, had risked everything for her. He stood, his gaze sweeping over the gathered court, then settling on Lord Kyle. "This execution is halted," he announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard. A murmur ran through the crowd. "Ilara will remain in my custody. The matter will be re-examined." Lord Cale stepped forward, his charm unfailing. "My king, with all due respect, the evidence was clear. The goblet was found in her possession." "Evidence can be manipulated, Lord Cale," Lyra said, his voice level, his eyes unblinking. "Whisper's actions today suggest a truth we have overlooked." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, a silent challenge. "If my wolf sees an injustice, then I must find it." He turned back to Alara, who was slowly rising from the block, her legs trembling. "You are not free, girl," he said, his voice firm, "but you are alive, and you will tell me everything." Alara met his gaze, a flicker of fear still present, but now mingled with a spark of defiance. She nodded, her chin lifted slightly. Whisper, as if sensing the unspoken agreement, let out a soft whine, then turned and pressed its head against Alara's hand. The wolf, the fearsome beast of the Alpha King, was gentle. Lyra watched, a new sense of unease settling in his gut. His wolf had never shown such affection to anyone outside his immediate family, certainly not to a common servant. This was more than mere intervention. It was an entanglement, a thread suddenly woven into the tapestry of his reign. He would find the truth behind Whisper's strange intervention, even if it meant unraveling the very fabric of his court. And Lord Cale, Lyra noted, was watching Alara with an intensity that went beyond simple concern for justice. A dangerous game had just begun. A royal decree, and courtly whispers, a collective gasp, sharp and sudden, ripped through the hushed courtyard. It was quickly followed by a cacophony of murmurs, a rising tide of disbelief that threatened to drown the very air. Lyra's voice, though usually a commanding rumble, was now infused with an uncharacteristic edge of confusion. "Take her to the dungeons, under my protection. This matter requires further scrutiny." The executioner, axe still poised, looked utterly bewildered. His gaze flickered between the king, the still growling Whisper, and the condemned Alara, who knelt motionless, her eyes wide with a fear that had yet to dissipate into understanding. Lord Kyle, ever the picture of stoic composure, finally broke his silence. "My king, with all due respect, the law is clear. The theft of a royal artifact is punishable by death. To house a confessed thief in the royal dungeons, a privilege usually reserved for political prisoners of high standing." His voice trailed off, laden with unspoken disapproval. Lyra's gaze, usually unreadable, narrowed imperceptibly. The law is clear, Kyle, but justice is not always so simple. Whisper's actions, they are unprecedented. I will not ignore them. His eyes swept over the assembled nobles, lingering on the faces contorted with outrage and confusion. The execution is stayed. I will re-examine this case personally. The court erupted. Voices clashed. A tempest of indignation. A royal decree based on a beast's whim? Someone shouted from the back. Heresy! Another cried, quickly hushed by a frantic neighbour. Lord Coil, seizing the moment, stepped forward. My king, I understand your concern for Whisper. Perhaps the wolf sensed a disturbance, an unfamiliar scent in the crowd, and reacted instinctively. To interpret it as divine intervention in a matter of justice, it sets a dangerous precedent. His tone was measured, reasonable, yet beneath it, Illyra detected a subtle current of something sharper, almost triumphant. Lyra, however, merely raised a hand, and the clamour, though not entirely silenced, dulled to a low thrum. My decision stands. Let it be known, any who question the wisdom of my wolf, question the wisdom of their king. The implicit threat hung heavy in the air, chilling the most vocal dissenters into silence. Two guards, their faces impassive, approached Illyra. Their hands, though not rough, were firm as they helped her to her feet. Her legs, still weak from the ordeal, threatened to buckle. Whisper, ever vigilant, nudged her arm with his great head, a soft rumble emanating from his chest that was strangely comforting. He followed her closely as the guards led her away from the gaping crowds, through the ornate archway, and into the cool, shadowed corridors of the palace. Illyra's mind reeled. One moment, the cold kiss of the axe. The next, the unexpected warmth of fur against her cheek and the king's decree. She was not free, that much was clear, but she was alive. And now, she was being led to the dungeons, a place of despair, yet under the king's protection. The irony was a bitter taste on her tongue. Her stomach churned with a nauseating mix of relief and terror. What did the king mean to do with her? Was this a prolonged torture? A public spectacle of her inevitable demise, merely delayed? As they descended a winding stone staircase, the air grew heavy and damp, carrying the faint, metallic scent of iron and something else, something fetid and despairing. Torchlight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The clang of the heavy iron gate as it opened and then slammed shut behind them echoed through the subterranean passages. A chilling finality. They passed rows of cells, each a skeletal cage of bars, some occupied by hunched figures, others empty and echoing. The guard stopped before a cell at the very end of the corridor, slightly larger than the others, with a small barred window set high in the wall. Whisper whined softly, pressing his nose against the cold iron as Illyra was ushered inside. Back in the sun-drenched courtyard, the court slowly dispersed, the buzz of conversation escalating into a torrent of speculation. Lord Kyle, ever the politician, moved among the bewildered nobles, a concerned frown etched on his face. "A difficult day for the king," he murmured to Lady Alanna, her silks rustling as she leaned in conspiratorially. His compassion is commendable, of course, but to risk the stability of the law for the sake of a feeling. He shook his head subtly, his eyes scanning the retreating figures of the court. The people need to see justice dispensed fairly, without exception. This raises questions. His words, laced with an almost imperceptible doubt, were like tiny seeds planted in fertile ground. They were not outright accusations, but rather artful suggestions, designed to cultivate unease. "And Whisper," Cale continued, lowering his voice further, as if sharing a profound secret. "He has never behaved this way. It's unsettling. A wild creature, unpredictable even at the best of times. I worry for the king's safety, and for the security of the realm, if such instincts are permitted to dictate matters of state. His gaze, sharp and calculating, followed King Lyra as the monarch, still accompanied by a nervous courtier, finally retreated from the courtyard, leaving behind a simmering cauldron of doubt and apprehension. The true game, Chaol knew, had only just begun. Eyes of the court. The clatter of an iron bucket against ancient flagstones echoed in the cavernous scullery, a stark counterpoint to the hushed grandeur Alara had glimpsed in the throne room. Her hands, still raw from the shackles, ached as she scrubbed a greasy pot, the scent of stale mutton and lye stinging her nostrils. She wasn't in the dungeons, not precisely. King Lyra's protection, she'd quickly learned, meant a gilded cage of servitude. Instead of a cell, she'd been given a straw pallet in a small, windowless room adjacent to the laundry and an endless list of menial tasks. Every scrape of her brush, every drip of water, felt amplified by the silence of her overseers. 3 scullery maids, their faces etched with suspicion, moved like ghosts, their gazes flicking to her whenever they thought she wasn't looking. Their whispers were like the rustle of dry leaves, indistinct but ever present, carrying snatches of words: thief, witchcraft, the king's folly. The air was thick with it, a palpable current of distrust that isolated her more thoroughly than any dungeon wall. One afternoon, tasked with polishing the silver in the silent antechamber off the main dining hall, Alara overheard more explicit murmurs. 2 ladies-in-waiting, draped in silks the colour of amethyst and jade, their voices barely above a sibilant hiss, paused near a tapestry depicting a hunting scene. "Never seen him so unhinged," the amethyst-clad woman breathed, her fan fluttering nervously. To stop an execution for a common thief, on the word of a beast. "Lord Chaol's words carry weight," the jade-clad one replied, her tone laced with a knowing agreement. "He spoke of precedence, of the realm's stability. The king, he seemed almost under a spell. A dark one, perhaps." Amethyst whispered, leaning closer. "They say she looked at him, and his wolf. Acted. It's unnatural, I tell you. A common girl, a thief, and now she walks our halls, albeit with a scrubbing brush." Alara's grip tightened on a silver candelabrum, her knuckles white. She kept her head down, feigning intense concentration, but every word was a fresh brand on her skin. The king's decision, so baffling to her, was a source of fear and outrage to the court. She was a living symbol of Lyra's perceived madness, a constant reminder of his unorthodox mercy. Later, as twilight bled through the high, arched windows, casting long shadows across the castle's main corridor, Alara was sent to deliver a basket of freshly laundered linens to the guard barracks. The task felt like a deliberate act of exposure, pushing her into the more public areas of the castle, where the scrutiny intensified. Heads turned as she passed, faces hardening, whispers dying down only to flare up again in her wake. The guards, in particular, watched her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. One, a hulking man named Borin with a scar dissecting his left eyebrow, blocked her path near the barracks entrance. His armor gleamed dully in the fading light, and the hilt of his sword rested heavily on his hip. He stood with his arms crossed, a sneer twisting his coarse features. "Well, well," he rumbled, his voice low and gravelly. "If it isn't the king's new pet." Alara stopped, clutching the basket tighter. She met his gaze, refusing to flinch, though a tremor ran through her. "I am delivering the laundry, sir." Borin took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You think we don't know what you are, girl? A common gutter rat, brought into our home by some trickery. The king's wolf, indeed." He scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. Some say it was no wolf's wisdom, but a witch's gaze that charmed him. His words echoed those she'd overheard, solidifying the narrative forming around her. She was a witch, a deceiver, an unholy influence on their king. "I am no witch," Ilara said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I am merely a servant, doing as I am told." Borin leaned in, his breath heavy with the scent of ale. "And what were you told to do, little thief, before the king's mercy? To steal, wasn't it? To take what wasn't yours?" His eyes raked over her, lingering on the ragged edge of her tunic. "Don't think for a moment that because you walk freely, you are truly free. We're watching you, every breath, every move. One wrong step, and that axe will find its mark, king's protection or no." The implicit threat hung in the air, a cold promise. He was not alone in his sentiment. She felt it in the collective weight of the court's eyes. Borin finally stepped aside, a contemptuous flick of his hand dismissing her. Ilara continued on, her hands clammy, the weight of the linen suddenly insignificant compared to the crushing burden of the court's judgment. She had survived the executioner's blade, but a new kind of terror had begun. She was not just a prisoner. She was a spectacle, an object of suspicion, every moment a test she didn't understand, and somewhere, hidden in the shadows, someone had set this stage for her, and for the king. Midnight visits. The rustle of heavy velvet drapes was Ilara's only warning. A shadow, deeper than the moonless night outside, detached itself from the wall of her small chamber. King Lyra, a silent sentinel, stood just inside the threshold, his presence a stark, cold counterpoint to the flickering candle she held. He had been doing this for a week now, appearing just after the castle quieted, observing her from various hidden nooks, often when she thought herself alone. Tonight, he had chosen her room itself. Ilara's breath hitched. She had learned to anticipate his phantom appearances, to feel the subtle shift in the air when his gaze fell upon her, even from across a cavernous hall. Yet, each time he materialized, a fresh jolt of fear, sharp and immediate, pierced through her. He never spoke, never moved closer than the edge of a room, merely watched, like a predator assessing its prey, she thought, though the analogy offered little comfort. He was a study in stillness, his face an impassive mask in the dim light. Those eyes, the color of twilight skies, held no warmth, no flicker of curiosity, only an unnerving intensity that made her skin prickle. She wondered what he sought, what anomaly he was dissecting with such meticulous focus. Was it the lingering scent of wild magic the court accused her of, or the secret she guarded, the impossible connection she herself didn't fully understand? One night, he found her in the deserted castle library, tracing the faded script of an ancient text on herbal remedies. He stood for an hour, a dark statue among the towering shelves, before retreating as silently as he arrived. Another time, he observed her from the archway leading to the kitchen as she peeled potatoes, her hands calloused and raw from the relentless labor. He saw her exhaustion, the tremor in her fingers, the dull ache in her back, but his expression remained unreadable. He offered no aid, no recognition of her toil. Tonight, in her chamber, the silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Ilara slowly lowered the candle, its flame dancing with her trembling hand. "My king," she managed, her voice a thin whisper. He made no acknowledgement. His gaze swept over the meager room, taking in the rough wool blanket on her cot, the single wooden stool, the worn tunic she wore. Then his eyes returned to her, fixing on the small, almost imperceptible scar just beneath her left eye, a relic from a childhood misadventure. "Why?" His voice, when it finally came, was a low growl, devoid of inflection. Ilara's mind raced. Why what, my king? The wolf. His eyes narrowed slightly. Explain. Her throat tightened. How could she explain something she herself didn't comprehend? I cannot, my king. He simply came. A flicker, perhaps, of frustration crossed his face, quickly suppressed. He chose you, not me, not any of my kin. You, a common thief. The words were a pronouncement, not a question. She swallowed hard. I did not ask for it, my king. I swear. He lingered for another few moments, his gaze piercing, as if trying to excavate the truth from her very soul. Then, with a subtle shift of his shoulders, he was gone, absorbed back into the shadows from which he had emerged. The next evening, Ilara was tasked with delivering a tray of stale bread and watered wine to the dungeons. The air grew colder, heavier, with each descent down the spiraling stone steps. The stench of mildew and despair clung to the damp walls. As she approached the deepest cells, a familiar, unnerving presence prickled at her senses. King Lyra stood before a barred door, his back to her, silhouetted against the single torch that sputtered weakly in the corridor. He was speaking in a low, intense voice, though Ilara couldn't make out the words. As she drew closer, he turned, his eyes meeting hers. There was a raw, almost desperate edge to his expression she had never seen before, quickly veiled. He simply nodded, a curt, dismissive gesture. Leave the tray. Ilara placed it on the floor, her eyes flicking towards the cell he had been addressing. A figure, barely visible in the gloom, huddled in a corner. She recognized the tattered clothes. It was Borin, the guard who had confronted her and been mysteriously imprisoned shortly after. As she turned to leave, a soft whimper echoed from the shadows behind King Lyra. A large, grey head emerged, followed by a powerful, muscular body. Whisper, the king's wolf, his fur a deep, mottled grey, padded silently to his master's side, his golden eyes fixing on Ilara. For a fleeting moment, the wolf's gaze held a warmth, an almost protective quality that Ilara rarely saw in any living creature now. She felt a strange pull, a familiar current of energy that pulsed between them, invisible to the king, yet undeniably present. Whisper nudged his nose into Lyra's hand, then looked back at Ilara, his tail giving a single, almost imperceptible flick before he settled at Lyra's feet, watching her retreat. Lyra's eyes, however, remained fixed on Ilara, a new intensity in their depths. He had seen the wolf's subtle acknowledgement, the brief, shared understanding that passed between the common thief and his most loyal companion. The unspoken connection, the silent language understood only by them, left a trace of bewildered frustration on the king's face. He still sought answers, but the wolf, his own heart, was slowly, inexplicably, leading him down a path he hadn't chosen. A whispered secret, the clatter of pots and pans echoed through the servants' quarters, a symphony of daily chores that usually faded into background noise. Today, however, every sound grated on Ilara's nerves. A week had passed since her confrontation with the king, a week of forced labor under the watchful eyes of guards who seemed to materialize out of shadows. She scrubbed at a stubborn stain on a silver platter, her mind replaying Lyra's intense gaze, his raw frustration. And then, the wolf, Whisper, a silent, warm presence that defied logic. Her thoughts were interrupted by hushed voices from the adjacent pantry. Two guards, their usual boisterous banter replaced by low murmurs, were speaking. Ilara paused, feigning absorption in her task, her ears straining. Still no sign of it, one guard grumbled, his voice thick with exasperation. Lord Kale's been breathing down everyone's neck, says it was crucial for the king's evening draft. The other guard sighed heavily. A missing package from the kitchens. Who would be foolish enough to misplace something meant for His Majesty? Ilara's breath hitched. A missing package from the kitchens. The word struck a chord, a faint, unsettling memory stirring in the depths of her mind. She tried to push it away, to focus on the glinting silver beneath her cloth. But the conversation continued, pulling her deeper into its current. "They've torn the place apart, Garen. Even interrogated that new scullery maid. What's her name? Ilara. Not that she'd know anything. Just a common thief, they say." A cold dread began to coil in Ilara's stomach. They were talking about her, about the very accusation that had landed her in this predicament, the one that had almost cost her life. "The king's furious," Garen continued, his voice dropping to an even lower whisper. "Not just about the missing draft, but something else. Something about the ingredients." "Poison, you think?" the first guard asked, a tremor in his voice. A jolt, sharp and sudden, coursed through Ilara. Poison. The word resonated with an alarming clarity. She remembered the day she was accused, the frantic search, the accusations of theft. They had blamed her for a missing pouch, a small, unassuming package that had been entrusted to her to deliver to the kitchen master. She had sworn she had placed it on the designated shelf, but it had vanished. She remembered the contents of that pouch now, not just herbs for a draught, but one particular rare herb, a deep crimson leaf, almost black at the edges, with a faint, acrid scent. She'd been told it was a special spice, exotic and valuable, but the memory that now surfaced was far more sinister. A conversation she had overheard weeks ago, a hushed exchange between two kitchen staff discussing the properties of various plants. One of them had described a specific herb, similar in appearance to the one in the pouch, as being highly toxic, capable of inducing a slow, agonizing death if consumed in even small quantities. The blood-fang lily, they had called it. The silver platter slipped from Ilara's trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the stone floor. The guards in the pantry fell silent instantly. Ilara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She scrambled to pick up the platter, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate. Garen's face appeared in the pantry doorway, his eyes narrowing as he took in her flustered state. "Everything all right in here, girl?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Ilara forced a shaky smile. Just a clumsy hand, sirs. Apologies." Garen's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before he grunted and retreated back into the pantry. Ilara listened as their hushed conversation resumed, but the words no longer registered. Her mind was a whirlwind of terrifying realizations. The missing package, the poisonous herb, the false accusation. It all coalesced into a horrifying truth. She hadn't been blamed for theft. She had been framed for an attempted poisoning. And not just any poisoning, an attempt on the king's life. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. The king's anger, his frustration with her, suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. He didn't just see a common thief, he saw a potential assassin. A pawn in a deadly game she hadn't even known she was playing. The wolf. Whisper's inexplicable protectiveness. What did that mean? Did it sense the truth? Or was it simply drawn to her for some other unknown reason, a reason that now felt infinitely more dangerous? The enormity of the deception settled over Ilara, a suffocating weight. She had been a sacrifice, a convenient scapegoat for a plot far grander and more treacherous than she could have ever imagined. Lord Kael's involvement, the pressure on the guards. It all pointed to a deeper conspiracy. And she, Ilara, the simple commoner accused of magic and theft, was inexplicably caught in its deadly web. Her life, spared by a moment of mercy and a wolf's inexplicable will, was now more perilous than ever. She knew something she shouldn't, something that could either save her or condemn her utterly. The seed of doubt. The scent of stale linens and fear clung to Alara as she moved through the servants' quarters, each scrub of the floorboards a drumbeat against her raw nerves. The conversation she'd overheard about the poisoned draft, the missing package, the rare herb, it all clicked into place with a sickening finality. She wasn't just accused of theft, she was a pawn in an attempted regicide, branded as a would-be assassin. The dread that had been a dull throb in her chest now clawed at her throat, tightening with every breath. Lord Cole. The name resonated with a cold, malevolent echo. He had engineered this, used her, and now she was trapped. Her life dangling by a thread even Whisper's inexplicable protection might not be able to save. The thought of approaching King Lyra, the man she was framed for trying to kill, felt like stepping off a cliff. Yet, what other choice did she have? The truth, however perilous, was her only weapon. She waited, heart hammering against her ribs, for an opportunity, a moment when the king might be less guarded, less surrounded by the impenetrable wall of his authority. It came late that afternoon. Lyra, his face a mask of weary intensity, was crossing the main courtyard, a lone figure silhouetted against the setting sun. His guards were a respectful distance behind, their presence a silent assertion of his power, yet allowing a sliver of space. Alara took a shaky breath, the dry dust in the air catching in her throat, and stepped forward. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice a reedy whisper that surprised even herself. Lyra paused, his head turning slowly, eyes like chips of obsidian fixing on her. There was no warmth, no recognition, only that same chilling, unreadable gaze she remembered from the execution block. I have information." He said nothing, merely watched her, his silence more potent than any command. Alara swallowed hard, her palms slick with sweat. About the reason I am here." She gestured vaguely to her rough-spun tunic, her dust-streaked face. "The theft. It wasn't theft, Your Majesty. It was a setup." A flicker, subtle as a shadow, crossed Lyra's eyes. Curiosity, suspicion. She couldn't tell. He remained impassive, but something in his stillness urged her on. "I overheard guards speaking," Alara continued, her words tumbling out, laced with a desperation she could no longer hide. "They spoke of a missing package from the kitchens, intended for your draft. A poisoned draft, they said. And the herb, the rare toxic herb, the one they found on me." Her voice cracked. "It was planted. I was framed, Your Majesty, for attempted murder. Lord Cale." The name hung in the air, a dangerous accusation. Lyra's jaw tightened, a barely perceptible clenching. He didn't interrupt, didn't dismiss her. Instead, he listened, his gaze sharpening, a new intensity entering their depths. It was as if a hidden mechanism within him had engaged, processing her words with an unnerving precision. He seemed to pull her story apart, piece by piece, examining each fragment for truth or fabrication. There was a raw, desperate edge to his stillness now, a frustration she hadn't seen before. When she finished, the courtyard was silent save for the distant cry of a hawk. Lyra finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the air. "Lord Kyle," he repeated, the name a stone in his mouth. "Are you certain of this claim, girl?" "I am, Your Majesty," Alara affirmed, meeting his gaze, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a fierce need to be believed. "I swear it. The guards said the package disappeared, that they suspected poison. And the herb. I saw it in the kitchens, but I never touched it until it was found on me." Lyra's eyes narrowed, a cold fire sparking within them. He looked past her, towards the palace walls, his mind clearly racing. The seed of doubt Alara had planted was taking root, intertwining with something already simmering beneath his stoic exterior. He turned, not to Alara, but to two of his most trusted guards, who had subtly drawn closer. "Sir Rorik, Sir Gareth," he commanded, his voice low but cutting through the twilight. "A discreet investigation. The kitchens. A missing package from 2 days past, intended for my draft. And the movements of Lord Cale in the days leading up to the accusation against this girl." His gaze flicked back to Alara, a fleeting, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. "Leave no stone unturned, and tell no one of this." The guards nodded, their faces grim and resolute. As they turned to carry out their orders, Lyra looked at Alara one last time. There was still no warmth, no explicit trust, but the unreadable depths of his eyes held a new, calculating glint. He had listened, and he believed enough to act. The burden of her secret, for a moment, felt a fraction lighter, but the true danger, she knew, had only just begun. Whisper's shadow. The days following Alara's desperate plea to the king were a strange blend of suffocating tension and an unexpected, almost bewildering peace. While the whispers of her attempted execution still echoed through the servants' quarters, a subtle shift occurred in the fortress's rhythm. Guards, once openly hostile or dismissive, now regarded her with a flicker of something akin to curiosity, their gazes lingering a moment too long. The cold shoulder of the court remained, a palpable animosity that prickled her skin whenever she passed a noble. But beneath it, the gears of Lyra's command were turning. Whisper was the most immediate, tangible change. The massive wolf, once a fleeting shadow in the king's retinue, now seemed to gravitate toward Alara with an almost possessive regularity. It was never a loud, demanding presence, but a silent, watchful one. She would find it waiting outside the kitchen door as she left with her morning chores, its amber eyes tracking her every movement. Sometimes she would feel a soft nudge against her hand as she knelt to clean a hearth, a warm, furry reassurance that sent shivers down her spine, not of fear, but of an inexplicable comfort. One afternoon, as she carried a heavy basket of linens through a deserted corridor, a scullery maid, known for her sharp tongue and loyalty to Lord Cale's faction, deliberately tripped her. Linen scattered, and Alara braced for the expected taunts. Before a single word could be uttered, a low growl rumbled, deep and resonant, from the shadowed archway. Whisper emerged, its hackles barely raised, but its intent clear. The maid's face, usually flushed with malicious glee, drained of colour. She scurried away without a backward glance, leaving Alara to gather the fallen fabric, her heart thrumming with a mixture of fear and profound gratitude. Whisper watched, then nudged a stray cloth back towards her with its nose before settling onto the cool stone floor, its head resting on its paws, eyes fixed on the empty corridor. The initial findings of Lyra's discreet investigation began to surface, delivered in hushed tones to the king's private study. The stablemaster, loyal to Lyra, reported an unusual movement of horses from Cale's private stables on the night of the incident, a departure not logged in the official records. A stable boy, easily intimidated, confessed to being paid a handful of silver to look the other way. More damning was the discovery that the rare herb Coil had referenced, the one meant to mask the poison, had indeed been recently purchased, not by Coil directly, but through a series of intermediaries, each transaction meticulously traced back to a merchant known to supply Cale's estate. The king's master of coin, a precise man with an eidetic memory for ledgers, confirmed an unusual withdrawal from Cole's personal accounts around that time, substantial enough to cover such a purchase and the bribes. Lyra sat in his study, the parchment detailing these findings spread before him. The evidence, while circumstantial, wove a tight net around Cale. The stable's surreptitious activity, the bribed boy, The circuitous purchase of the herb, the unexplained withdrawal, each thread, insignificant on its own, when braided together, painted a clear picture. He remembered Ilara's direct gaze, the raw honesty in her voice as she recounted Coil's cruelty. He had dismissed it then as a desperate fabrication, but now a flicker of something colder than suspicion ignited within him. His wolf, Whisper, lay curled by the hearth, its eyes occasionally lifting to meet his, a silent affirmation of the unsettling truth unfolding. Ilara, unaware of the specific details unearthed, felt the subtle shift in the fortress's atmosphere. The oppressive weight of accusation had lessened, replaced by a cautious optimism. Whisper's unwavering presence was a profound comfort, a soft anchor in the stormy waters of her existence. When the wolf would lie near her, its warm breath a gentle rhythm against her skin, she would sometimes reach out, tentatively, to stroke its thick fur. The texture was coarse, yet surprisingly soft, and the sheer power contained within the animal was a constant reminder of the king's distant, yet undeniable protection. It was a strange dichotomy, the impassive king who kept her alive, and his wolf, a warm, breathing guardian. She began to understand that Whisper wasn't just a pet, but an extension of Lyra, a manifestation of his instincts. Its protective presence, therefore, was not merely an animal's whim, but a reflection of the king's deeper, unspoken judgment. It gave her courage, enough to meet the lingering gazes of the guards without flinching, enough to hold her head higher as she navigated the treacherous corridors. The invisible shield of Whisper's shadow offered a reprieve she had never dared to dream of, a silent promise that, for now, she was safe. And as the investigation's tendrils tightened around Lord Kael, Lyra, in the quiet solitude of his study, began to accept the unthinkable. Ilara had been telling the truth. Kael's fury. The whispers in the corridors had changed, a subtle shift in tone that Ilara couldn't quite place, but felt. No longer were they solely filled with condemnation and fear. A new thread of curiosity, even a grudging respect, seemed to weave through the tapestry of court gossip. It was a fragile thing, easily shattered, but it was there, a testament to the king's ongoing investigation and Whisper's unyielding presence. The wolf was a shadow, a silent sentinel, his amber eyes often fixed on Ilara, a comforting weight in her periphery. His protection wasn't just physical, it was a visible statement of the king's evolving trust, a shield against the venomous glances and outright hostility that had once been her daily bread. Ilara was in the library, a rare indulgence granted by the king, perusing ancient texts on herbal remedies, a subject she found herself drawn to, given her recent brush with a particularly potent one. The scent of old parchment and dust motes dancing in the afternoon light filled the air, a tranquil reprieve from the court's constant undercurrent of tension. She traced the elegant script of a forgotten scholar, lost in the delicate balance of hemlock and nightshade, when a shadow fell across the page. "Enjoying your newfound freedom, girl?" The voice, slick with disdain, sent a shiver down her spine. Lord Kael. Ilara slowly looked up, her gaze meeting his. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, now burned with a barely suppressed fury. The accusation in his tone was clear, a stark contrast to the outward composure he usually maintained. He stood over her, a dark silhouette against the library's tall windows, his arms crossed, a snare twisting his lips. He was dressed in his usual opulent silks, but today they seemed to cling to him like a second skin of malice. "Lord Kael," Ilara replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She refused to cower. Not anymore. "You've caused quite a stir, haven't you?" He continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, a mere servant, overturning the king's judgment, stirring up unpleasantness. He leaned closer, his scent, a mix of expensive cologne and something acrid, like fear and rage, assaulting her senses. "You think you're safe, don't you? That the king's pet will protect you forever?" Alara's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden silence of the library. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a palpable wave of hostility. He was trying to intimidate her, to break her, to silence her before she could speak the truth that was slowly, inexorably coming to light. She remembered the stable boy's terrified confession, the bribed blacksmith, the circuitous route of the rare herb. Pieces were falling into place. "The truth has a way of revealing itself, Lord Cale," she said, her voice a little firmer than she expected. His eyes narrowed, glittering with a dangerous light. "And the truth, girl, can be manipulated, twisted, or it can simply disappear, along with those who speak it." He took another step closer, his hand subtly flexing at his side, as if he longed to reach for her throat. The implication was unmistakable, a thinly veiled threat of violence. The air crackled with unspoken menace. Just then, a low, guttural growl rumbled through the quiet space, vibrating through the very floorboards. It was deep, resonant, and utterly terrifying. Lord Cale froze, his menacing posture faltering. From behind him, silent as a phantom, emerged Whisper. The wolf's hackles were raised, a ridge of bristling fur along his spine. His lips were peeled back, revealing formidable fangs, gleaming white against the dark cavity of his mouth. A low snarl escaped his throat, a warning that promised swift and brutal consequences if Kyle dared to take another step. Whisper's amber eyes, usually so watchful, were now narrowed, focused entirely on the Lord, burning with an ancient, untamed fury. Lord Cale's face, which had been contorted with anger, blanched. He took an involuntary step back, his carefully constructed facade of control crumbling. The sheer primal power emanating from the wolf was undeniable, suffocating. He understood the unspoken language of the forest, the warning of a predator about to strike. "Your pet is rather ill-mannered," Kyle managed to stammer, his voice a strained whisper, devoid of its earlier bravado. Whisper's growl intensified, a visceral sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the library. The wolf shifted his weight, a silent promise of attack in his coiled muscles. His gaze never left Kyle, a relentless, burning accusation. Kyle swallowed hard, his eyes darting from Whisper's menacing face to Alara's unwavering stare. He was caught. The wolf's presence was a direct extension of the king's will, a clear message that Alara was not to be touched. Retreat was his only option. With a final, venomous glare at Alara, a promise of future retribution simmering in his eyes, Lord Kyle turned abruptly and strode out of the library, his silks rustling with the agitated speed of his departure. The heavy oak door swung shut behind him with a thud, leaving silence in its wake. Alara let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her knees felt weak. She looked at Whisper, who had immediately calmed, his hackles lowering, his fangs receding. He padded over to her, nudging her hand with his large head, a soft, reassuring gesture. She reached out, her fingers tangling in the thick fur behind his ears, her gratitude a silent current between them. The message was clear. She was not alone, and Coil's fury, while terrifying, had been rendered impotent by the king's wolf. The king's confrontation. The scent of parchment and old wood filled King Lyra's chambers, a stark contrast to the volatile emotions simmering within him. Spread across his oak desk were the results of his discreet investigation, led by Captain Valerius, a collection of meticulously documented discrepancies, forged signatures, and testimonies from terrified stable hands who had heard things in the dead of night. Each damning piece of evidence was a shard of ice pressing against the growing certainty in his gut. Kyle's betrayal was real. Whisper, a silent shadow at his side, occasionally nudged a stray paper with his nose, his dark eyes fixed on Lyra with an almost human understanding. "Send for Lord Cale," Lyra commanded, his voice a low rumble that resonated with barely contained fury. The guard bowed and exited, leaving Lyra alone with Whisper and the weight of his suspicions. The air in the room thickened with anticipation, each tick of the grandfather clock echoing like a hammer blow. Kyle arrived, his usual confident stride, faltering only slightly as he took in the scene. His gaze flickered from the king's stern face to the scattered documents, then finally to Whisper, who merely offered a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Kyle's jaw tightened. "Your Majesty," he began, a carefully constructed pleasantness in his tone. Lyra didn't bother with pleasantries. He pushed a stack of papers across the polished surface. "Explain this, Kyle." Kyle picked up the top document, a ledger detailing questionable transactions for materials that never arrived, his brow furrowing in a feigned display of confusion. "It appears to be a clerical error, Your Majesty. Easily rectified." "Clerical error." Lyra's voice rose, the thinly veiled control snapping. "And this? And this?" He slammed his palm on a report detailing a suspiciously absent patrol on the night of his father's death, followed by a signed order, bearing Kyle's distinct flourish, redirecting vital guards to a phantom skirmish. "Are these also clerical errors?" Kyle's face, usually so composed, began to flush. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "These are fabrications, Your Majesty. Lies spun by enemies seeking to undermine my loyalty, perhaps by that girl you've so foolishly spared." His voice dripped with disdain, his eyes darting to Whisper, who was now fully alert, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Ilara has done nothing but reveal the truth," Lyra retorted, rising from his chair, his own alpha presence radiating through the room. "Unlike you, Kyle, who has woven a tapestry of deceit around me in this court. I am loyal, Lyra," Kyle roared, his composure finally shattering. His voice, usually so smooth, was raw with a mixture of fear and outrage. "I have served this kingdom faithfully. This is an insult to my honor, a slander fueled by a peasant's desperate lies." The argument spilled out of Lyra's private chambers, their raised voices carrying through the antechamber and into the main hall. Courtiers, drawn by the unusual commotion, began to gather, their faces a mixture of shock and avid curiosity. Lyra pointed to a forged warrant bearing his own seal, authorizing Ilara's immediate execution for regicide. This was delivered before a proper investigation could even begin. "You sought to silence her before the truth could emerge." "I acted on what I believed to be a clear threat to the crown," Kyle shrieked, his face now a mottled red. He gestured wildly. "She was a suspect, a low-born girl found near the scene. I merely ensured justice was swift." Whisper let out a guttural snarl, a sound that made several courtiers gasp and recoil. Lyra placed a steadying hand on Whisper's massive head, his gaze never leaving Kyle's trembling form. "Justice, Kyle, is a nuanced thing, not a weapon to be wielded for personal gain or to cover up your own treachery." The gathered crowd buzzed with whispers. "Lord Kyle! Treachery!" a lady-in-waiting whispered, her fan fluttering nervously. "But he's always been so devoted," another replied, a knowing glint in his eye. Or perhaps just ambitious. The sheer audacity of Cale's outburst, his public defiance of the king, sent tremors through the court. Rumors spread like wildfire, carried on hushed breaths and nervous glances. Did you hear? The king accused Cale of treason. He tried to frame the girl, they say, to hide his own hand in the old king's death. The court, once a unified front against Alara, began to fracture. Loyalties, once assumed, were now openly questioned. Allies of Cale, mostly those who benefited from his influence, looked on with dawning horror, while others, secretly resentful of his power, watched with barely concealed satisfaction. Kyle, seeing the faces of his former supporters turn from him, his world crumbling, finally recoiled. His bravado withered under Lyra's unwavering stare and Whisper's silent, menacing presence. He swallowed hard, his throat working. "This is madness, Your Majesty. You will regret this accusation. I swear my innocence." But his voice lacked conviction, a desperate plea rather than a firm denial. With one last, furious glare at Lyra and Whisper, Kyle turned and stormed out of the hall, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The king's confrontation had irrevocably shifted the very foundation of his court. The heart of the storm. The clatter of Coil's gauntlet striking the marble floor echoed through the stunned silence, a punctuation mark to the ruin of his ambition. Alara, standing near the shadowed archway where Lyra had positioned her, felt the tremor of it through the soles of her worn boots. The court, a tableau of frozen faces, was split down the middle. On one side, those who had always fawned over Kyle now wore expressions of dawning horror, their loyalty curdling into fear. On the other, a flicker of grim satisfaction, quickly veiled from those who had privately resented Cale's ascent. She watched them, a dizzying whirl of silks and furs, and for the first time truly understood her position, not as a condemned servant, not as a king's pet, but as the unforeseen fulcrum upon which the kingdom's fate now balanced. She was the inconvenient truth, the stone dropped into still waters, the ripple effect of which was only just beginning to spread. The air thrummed with unspoken questions, with accusations yet to form, with fear both righteous and self-serving. Her own breath hitched, a faint taste of ash on her tongue. The king's gaze, sharp and predatory, was fixed on Coil, but Alara felt its periphery, a subtle pressure acknowledging her presence, her centrality. Lyra's voice, when it came, was a low growl, devoid of the theatrical flair Coil had so desperately tried to conjure. "Take him to the dungeon. His chambers are to be searched for further evidence. Any who aided him, willingly or unwillingly, will answer to me." The guards, momentarily frozen in their shock, sprang to action. Coil, his face a mask of purple fury, struggled, shouting epithets that quickly dissolved into incoherent snarls as they dragged him away. The ensuing silence was heavier, charged with a new, dangerous energy. The court shifted, a collective exhalation of breath, and then a murmur began, like the rustle of leaves before a storm. Eyes, 100 pairs, swiveled towards Alara. They were no longer the eyes of judgment, but of bewildered curiosity, of dawning comprehension, and in some, a nascent respect. She felt their weight, a physical burden pressing on her shoulders. Lyra turned then, his eyes finding hers across the expanse of the hall. He dismissed the remaining courtiers with a curt wave of his hand, a clear signal that the public drama was over, though the private ramifications had just begun. As the last hesitant noble bowed and retreated, leaving only the king, Captain Valerius, and a few trusted guards, Lyra strode towards her. Whisper, who had been a silent, imposing presence by Lyra's side throughout the confrontation, now padded softly forward, nudging Ilara's hand with his wet nose. His gaze, intelligent and unwavering, seemed to convey a silent acknowledgement of the storm they had weathered, and the greater one still brewing. "Are you all right, Ilara?" Lyra's voice was softer now, though still laced with a barely suppressed tension. His eyes, the colour of twilight, scrutinized her face. She nodded, finding her voice surprisingly steady. "I am, Your Majesty. Though the air feels thick with it." She gestured vaguely to the empty hall, to the lingering scent of fear and betrayal. He stood close, a palpable heat radiating from him. The raw power that had flared during his confrontation with Kyle still simmered beneath his composed exterior. "The storm has only just reached its heart," he said, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing. "You are at its very centre now." Alara met his gaze, unafraid. "I understand, Your Majesty." The weight she felt was not just from the court's scrutiny, but from the sudden, profound realization of her shared destiny with this man. Her survival, his vindication, the kingdom's stability, all were threads now inextricably woven together. The injustice she had endured had become the catalyst for a much larger unraveling. The very ground beneath their feet felt unstable, the foundations of the kingdom suddenly suspect. She felt a profound weariness, a deep ache in her bones that had nothing to do with physical exertion, and everything to do with the sheer scale of the turmoil she now embodied. Lyra reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her arm, a fleeting, almost accidental touch that sent a jolt through her. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of shared burden, a silent pact forged in the crucible of betrayal. "We face this together, Alara," he murmured, his voice a low promise. The words hung in the quiet air, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded, yet holding a power all their own. The danger was not over. It had merely shifted, deepened, and become intensely personal. Hidden truths. The oppressive silence of the throne room, following Kyle's ignominious removal, still clung to the tapestries and carved stone. Alara felt the weight of it, a suffocating blanket woven from 1,000 unspoken accusations and the lingering scent of betrayal. Lyra, though outwardly composed, radiated a coiled intensity. He dismissed the remaining guards with a sharp flick of his wrist, leaving only Whisper, Alara, and himself in the vast, echoing space. "This is far from over," Lyra stated, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. He paced before the empty throne, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. "Kyle's ambition runs deeper than mere resentment. The evidence we've uncovered. It's a tapestry of manipulation, not a single thread." Alara watched him, her own weariness battling a growing sense of resolve. She was no longer the trembling servant, nor the condemned prisoner. She was the inconvenient truth, a wrench thrown into the meticulously crafted machinery of Kale's deceit, and by extension, she was now inextricably linked to Lyra's vindication and the kingdom's precarious future. The court's eyes, she knew, would be on her, waiting for her to stumble, to prove herself unworthy of the king's inexplicable trust. But fear, strangely, had become a distant echo. Whisper, who had been curled at the base of the throne, suddenly lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His ears twitched, swiveling towards a section of the wall to the left of the dais, a seamless expanse of polished, dark wood. His hackles rose, and a sharp bark ripped through the silence, startling Alara. Lyra stopped his pacing, his head snapping towards Whisper. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, his brow furrowing. He knew his wolf's instincts were rarely wrong. Whisper let out another insistent bark, then padded purposefully towards the wall, nudging it with his powerful snout. He whined, a sound of frustration and urgency, then began to scratch at the surface, his claws making a soft, rasping sound against the wood. Lyra exchanged a look with Alara, a flicker of curiosity mingling with concern in his eyes. He approached Whisper cautiously, running a hand over the smooth wood. "There's nothing here, Whisper," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Ilara, however, felt a strange pull. She remembered Kyle's furtive glances, the way his eyes had sometimes darted to that very section of the wall during court proceedings, a fleeting, almost imperceptible movement. She stepped closer, her fingers tracing the faint lines of the wood grain. There was a subtle inconsistency, a barely perceptible seam that ran vertically, expertly concealed. "It's a door," Ilara breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "A hidden passage." Lyra's eyes narrowed, following her finger. He pressed against the wood, then ran his palm over it, searching for a latch or a mechanism. Whisper, meanwhile, was growing more agitated, his growls deeper, his body tense with anticipation. "Stand back!" Lyra commanded, his voice sharp. He took a step back, then, with a surge of his immense strength, slammed his shoulder against the seemingly solid wall. A faint click echoed, followed by a low groan of protesting wood. Slowly, silently, a section of the wall slid inward, revealing a gaping black maw. A narrow, unlit passage leading into absolute darkness. The air that wafted out was cold and stagnant, carrying a faint, acrid scent. Whisper surged forward, disappearing into the blackness. Lyra immediately drew a small, intricately carved lantern from his belt, igniting the wick with a spark of internal magic. The warm, golden light pushed back the oppressive gloom, revealing a short, winding tunnel. "Stay close," Lyra instructed Ilara, his voice low and serious. He led the way, his broad shoulders almost brushing both sides of the passage. Ilara followed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The passage was unadorned, the rough-hewn stone walls damp and cool to the touch. The acrid smell grew stronger with every step. After a few tense moments, the passage opened into a small, circular chamber. The air here was even heavier, thick with the cloying scent of strange herbs and something metallic. Lyra's lantern illuminated a chaotic scene, a workbench littered with vials of various sizes and colours, dried herbs bundled and hung from the low ceiling, and a large, heavy chest overflowing with scrolls and parchment. "By the gods," Lyra muttered, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. He moved to the workbench, picking up a small, dark vial. He uncorked it, sniffing cautiously, his face contorted in disgust. Hemlock and belladonna, a potent collection. He swept his gaze over the other vials, his expression hardening with each discovery. "These aren't for healing. These are poisons, Ilara. Enough to fell an army." Ilara's gaze drifted to the overflowing chest. She reached in, pulling out a scroll. Her eyes scanned the elegant script, and a chill snaked down her spine. "These are forged documents," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Royal seals, orders signed with your name, Lyra." She unfurled another, her breath catching. "Warrants for the arrest of several high-ranking nobles. Accusations of treason against families known for their unwavering loyalty to your lineage." Lyra snatched the scroll from her, his eyes blazing with a fury that was almost palpable. "He was planning to eliminate them all," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "to destabilize the entire court, to sow chaos and fear, and then to seize power in the ensuing vacuum. He wasn't just planning to betray me. He was planning to dismantle the very foundations of the kingdom." The full horror of Cale's ambition, far grander and more insidious than they had imagined, unfolded before them in that hidden, dusty chamber. It was a cold, calculated plot to rip the kingdom apart, piece by agonizing piece. And Ilara, the unwitting catalyst, had been the first domino Kyle had intended to fall. The serpent's last strike. The scent of polished wood and old parchment still clung to Lyra and Elara as they emerged from the hidden chamber, the weight of Chaol's treachery pressing heavily upon them. The forged documents, the poisons, it painted a chilling portrait of ambition unchecked. Lyra's jaw was set, his gaze distant, already strategizing. Elara, though weary, felt a surge of resolve. Chaol's threat was no longer a whispered accusation. It was a tangible, venomous serpent coiling around the kingdom's throat. The following morning, the great hall buzzed with an unusual tension. The scheduled court session, ostensibly for petitions and pronouncements, felt like the prelude to a storm. King Lyra, usually radiating a calm authority, now held a suppressed fury that made the air crackle. Elara stood a few paces behind him, her presence still a quiet defiance, a living testament to Chaol's failed plot. She watched Chaol enter, his usual swagger replaced by a tightly wound energy, his eyes, dark and glittering, darting between Lyra and her. A subtle tremor ran through Elara. This wasn't the Chaol she knew, the one who tried to intimidate with veiled threats. This was a man on the precipice. Lyra addressed the court, his voice resonating with controlled power. He spoke of new evidence, of a conspiracy against the crown, of threats to the very stability of the realm. The murmurs grew, then silenced as his gaze locked onto Chaol. "Lord Chaol." Lyra's voice dropped, each word a hammer blow. "You stand accused of treason." A ripple of shock went through the assembled nobles. Chaol, for a split second, seemed to deflate, his face paling. Then, a flicker of something desperate, a cornered animal's last stand, ignited in his eyes. "Treason!" Chaol scoffed, a sneer twisting his lips. Against whom? A king so easily swayed by her? He pointed a venomous finger at Elara, his voice dripping with contempt. "This servant! This witch who poisoned your judgment!" Elara felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She had expected denial, bluster, but not this raw public attack, a final attempt to discredit her and thus Lyra's accusations. She met Chaol's glare with a steadiness that surprised even herself, her fear now a distant echo. "My judgment," Lyra growled, his control snapping, "is sharper than you could ever imagine, Chaol. Sharper than you calculated when you forged these." He slammed a scroll onto the dais, the crack echoing through the hushed hall. It was one of the forged documents, bearing Lyra's royal seal, authorizing the removal of a loyal noble, signed in a hand eerily similar to his own. Chaol's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine terror replacing his defiance. He knew he was trapped. His gaze darted wildly, seeking an escape, an advantage, and then Elara saw it. A subtle shift in his stance, a tightening of his right hand beneath his cloak. Her breath hitched. A dagger. "Lyra! Watch out!" she screamed, the words tearing from her throat, raw and urgent. Her warning sliced through the stunned silence. Lyra, already on edge, instinctively flinched, his eyes snapping to Chaol. It was just enough. As Chaol lunged, a flash of steel in his hand, Lyra was able to twist, deflecting the initial, fatal thrust meant for his heart. The dagger scraped across his arm, a shallow but stinging cut. But Chaol, fueled by a mad desperation, didn't stop. He raised the dagger again, aiming for Lyra's unprotected neck. It was a swift, brutal movement, intended to silence the king forever. Before Chaol could complete his arc, a blur of grey fur launched itself from Lyra's side. Whisper, who had been lying unobtrusively near the throne, was a coiled spring unleashed. The wolf moved with an incredible silent speed, a phantom in the chaos. With a guttural snarl that vibrated through the very floorboards, Whisper slammed into Chaol's side, a force of nature. Chaol cried out, the dagger flying from his grasp as he was thrown off balance. Whisper didn't hesitate. The wolf's powerful jaws clamped down on Kyle's sword arm, not with the intention to kill, but to incapacitate, to hold him in an iron grip. Kyle screamed, a sound of pain and utter defeat, collapsing to his knees, Whisper's teeth still firmly locked around his arm. The dagger lay glinting on the polished floor, a stark testament to his treachery. The court erupted in a cacophony of gasps, shouts, and terrified whispers. Guards rushed forward, seizing Kale, who was now a whimpering, pathetic figure, held fast by Whisper's unwavering grip. The betrayal, once a quiet suspicion, was now laid bare for all to see, a desperate, violent act. Ilara watched, her heart pounding, relief washing over her. Lyra, his face a mask of furious triumph, nodded to Whisper, who released Kyle with a final, warning growl. "Take him to the dungeons," Lyra commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "and let no one approach him without my express permission." His gaze swept over the shocked faces of the court. "Let this be a lesson. Treason against the crown will be met with the swiftest and most severe justice." As Kale was dragged away, his eyes, filled with hatred and despair, locked onto Ilara's one last time. But Ilara met his gaze without flinching. The serpent had made its last strike, and it had failed. An unspoken promise. The heavy silence that followed Kale's capture was fractured only by the ragged breaths of the guards, still grappling with the lingering adrenaline. Lyra, his chest heaving, slowly turned from the entangled bodies of Kyle and his fallen assassins. His eyes, still blazing with a primal fury, swept across the stunned faces of the court, lingering for a long moment on Ilara. She stood precisely where Whisper had pushed her, a faint tremor running through her frame, but her gaze met his unflinchingly. "Lord Kale." Lyra's voice, though lower now, resonated with an unyielding command. "Will face the full judgment of the crown for his treason. His accomplices will share his fate." He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle. "Let it be known that the accusations leveled against Ilara were false. Baseless fabrications designed to mask Kyle's insidious plot." A collective gasp rippled through the great hall. Faces that had been etched with suspicion now shifted, some turning towards Ilara with dawning comprehension, others still processing the abrupt reversal. Lyra's gaze softened infinitesimally as it returned to Ilara. "This woman," he continued, his voice now carrying a different weight, one of quiet respect, not only endured false accusation with unwavering fortitude, but she also provided the crucial warning that saved my life tonight. Her courage, in the face of such treachery, has been nothing short of extraordinary." Ilara felt a wave of heat wash over her cheeks, a mix of relief and profound embarrassment. To be absolved, to be praised in front of the very people who had condemned her, felt surreal. She could feel the stares, the whispers, the frantic re-evaluation happening all around her. It was a dizzying shift, a complete inversion of her world. Lyra took a step towards her, and the court held its breath. Whisper, who had moved to stand beside Lyra, let out a soft, almost imperceptible rumble, his golden eyes fixed on Ilara. When Lyra reached her, he didn't touch her, but his presence enveloped her, a palpable warmth in the cold hall. His eyes, no longer burning with rage, held a depth she had never seen before, a complex tapestry of gratitude, regret, and something more profound, something that spoke of a burgeoning understanding between them. "You have faced a crucible," Lyra said, his voice dropping to a low tone meant only for her, "and emerged unburnt. I owe you a debt that cannot be easily repaid." Ilara, suddenly acutely aware of their proximity, of the hundreds of eyes upon them, found her voice. "My king," she began, her throat tight, "I only did what was right." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Lyra's lips. "Right," he echoed, his gaze holding hers. A rare commodity, it seems, and a dangerous one for those who wield it with such conviction. Their eyes locked, and in that shared moment, the clamour of the court faded into a distant hum. There was an unspoken exchange, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible journey they had traversed together. From the execution block to this public absolution, their paths had intertwined in ways neither could have predicted. It was a recognition of the danger she had faced, the truth she had carried, and the undeniable connection that had formed between them, forged in the crucible of suspicion and betrayal. It was a promise of sorts, a silent vow that the precarious alliance born of necessity had now deepened into something far more enduring. "See to it that Lord Cale is secured in the deepest dungeon," Lyra commanded, his voice once again resonating through the hall, pulling the court from its stunned silence. "No one is to speak with him without my express permission." He then turned, his gaze sweeping over the assembled nobles, a clear warning in his eyes. "This treachery has revealed a rot within our court. It will be excised." As the guards moved to obey, a different kind of buzz started to circulate. The fear of Cale's tyranny was replaced by a fresh apprehension. The king's wrath, when finally unleashed, was a formidable force. Lyra turned back to Alara. He gestured subtly with his hand, not a dismissal, but an invitation. "You will remain here," he stated, his tone brooking no argument, "by my side." Alara felt a jolt, no longer a servant, no longer an accused, but a presence, a trusted companion. The weight of the court's judgment had lifted, replaced by the far heavier weight of the king's trust. She had nothing, no belongings, no position, yet here she was, standing at the precipice of a new, unimaginable existence. She looked at Whisper, who watched her with intelligent, steady eyes. The wolf had been the first to see beyond the accusations, the first to offer her a lifeline. Now, the king, guided in part by his silent companion, had followed suit. With a slight nod, Alara moved to stand a step behind Lyra, a silent sentinel in the shifting political landscape. Her weariness was profound, but a new resolve settled deep within her. The world had irrevocably changed, and she, the unassuming girl who had faced the executioner's blade, was no longer just a survivor. She was a catalyst, a witness, and now an unforeseen constant in the king's turbulent reign. The unspoken promise between them hung in the air, a fragile but potent thing, waiting to unfurl in the days to come. The true battle, she knew, had only just begun.